Dozens of people are reported dead in Syria.
الإرهابيون القتلة يستخدمون أبواقهم لإعلان
images that have stunned the world.
قاطعا استخدام أي مواد كيماوية أو سامة.
I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons.
These heinous actions by the Assad regime cannot be tolerated.
We're going to begin with those disturbing images from Syria, the aftermath of that chemical weapons attack that led to the U.S. missile strike. That video went to air showing the dead or dying victims, many of them children. And 50 hours later, American missiles were hitting their targets. The U.S. strike came 77 days into Donald Trump's presidency, 2.5 months that had been marked by unprecedented hostility between the U.S. news media and a new presidential administration. But nothing changes the narrative quite like pictures of a few Tomahawk missiles being launched into the night sky, and the tone shifted. Journalists praised Donald Trump's decisiveness, his morality, as well as the might of the U.S. military. He was described as something he'd seldom been accused of, being presidential. There are plenty of media angles in this story, from the haunting images of victims of chemical weapons, the impact the pictures are said to have had on Trump, to the video supplied by the Pentagon from those warships that is now driving this story. Our starting point this week is the Eastern Mediterranean, the launch site of the first direct U.S. airstrike on the forces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. News travels fast, particularly when the pictures look like this. Roughly 2.5 hours after the missiles hit their intended target, the images distributed by the Pentagon were on the American airwaves, changing perceptions. Donald Trump watches a lot of TV, and that night he would have loved watching the U.S. media revert to form.
We've seen this time and time again. We've seen it in the first Gulf War. We've seen it in the second Iraqi war. And the media did a 180, going from attacking Donald Trump to praising him, like Fareed Zakaria.
I think Donald Trump became President of the United States.
And others on MSNBC, Brian Williams.
We see these beautiful pictures at night.
The media just falls in love with this affair.
Well, I want to say bizarrely sycophantic, but in a way it's not a surprise at all. You had the New York Times talking about how Donald Trump was acting from the heart when he launched this attack. I think they later amended their headline. The Washington Post was similarly effusive in its praise for the president.
It was notable that certain tropes and aspects that were used to attack the Trump administration, that the Trump administration is unpredictable and that it lacks experience and doesn't communicate across the administration well. All this was turned into something positive.
And even beautiful little babies.
Because morality was projected on that inexperience, in saying that actually President Trump was very moved by the images of the dead and dying Syrians under the chemical attack, that he took an impulsive moral decision to intervene.
And I feel like many of these media outlets very much wanted to support Trump. They have this very strong idea of the inherent dignity of the presidency, and they don't want to lose their access to and their ability to, in a way, suck up to power.
And I think there is a certain almost a need for familiar media tropes. A president announcing a military attack or launching a war is very familiar, and in a way it has the ability to, perhaps ironically, to soothe anxieties, because it shows that there is a certain continuity in policy in the pursuit of American interests.
This was a picture-driven story from the start, one that is paradoxical to the core. Chemical weapons have been banned for 20 years now. Reports of their use will always make headlines. But unlike conventional weapons, they leave bodies intact when they kill. The resulting news images, while shocking, are not graphic. There's no blood, no severed limbs.
Warning.
As horrifying as the pictures of chemical warfare are, news outlets are more likely to broadcast them than pictures of a bomb or a mortar attack, legal forms of warfare that are considered too bloody, too much for audiences to bear.
This is the problem. We don't trust the public as media.
We think that, they might be too shocked by these images. Yeah, they might. But they also might get outraged like they have every time one of these stories has managed to push through. The conflict is one of the most documented wars in our history. And the question is, what do we show, what do we not show?
Not to say that seeing the effect on children after a chemical strike is not horrifying, but there are far more horrifying images, and there are far horrifying stories of entire families getting wiped out, half the population is displaced. And so we have one incident like this, and all of a sudden Trump reacts because nothing draws public opinion behind a president like ordering a strike when the media plays up an attack like by chemical weapons.
And we hope that as long as America stands for justice, then peace and harmony will, in the end, prevail.
Images of chemical attacks, for lack of better word, privileged in news coverage and also in policy. Many Syrians say that the world actually does not care about the deaths of Syrians, they only care about how Syrians die. And when they die through chemical attacks, it gets more attention.
But the coverage has grown less frequent. Syria is perilous and expensive to cover. It's complex and confusing. Multiple factions and countries involved. And many news outlets have drifted away, returning only when the news turns dramatic. And when news coverage is more occasional than constant, that creates a lack of context that is ripe for exploitation.
All you get is the immediacy of the suffering. It's not necessarily untrue, but when this method is repeated and when this comes together, you get a view of suffering in which it's always essentially inexplicable, and news consumers who see these images, which is very strong urge to do something, to end this suffering. But because it's entirely shorn of context, it can be very easily used for very malign means by, in particular, by the people in power. And that is a form of propaganda without any lies even being necessary.
Our job as journalists is to get the pictures out there. Whether the right thing happens for the wrong reasons, that we cannot predict, but it is our job to tell these stories. And if we stop doing that, and if we stop expecting a change or expecting action from these stories, then what are we doing? We're just looking at other people's pain and putting it on TV. I don't know Donald Trump, obviously, so I can't tell you for sure how he feels or how this has impacted him. But I think public outrage has a lot to do with this, and I think public outrage on Syria crimes is a good thing.